Hello everyone, welcome to the video about Article 11 in ECHR, aka the Convention. So let's get right to it. For the first thing you need to know is that Article 11 always is applied in the light of Article 10, meaning if you want to call out your right to demonstrate and associate, that would mean that you're also applying your right for free speech. Now, what this could mean technically is just that a court case could include both the infringement of your right to speak freely and the infringement of your right to demonstrate and associate. But you should know then that you cannot demonstrate and associate without being able to have the right of free speech. However, you can have the right to having free speech without needing to get into your right of demonstrating. Moving on, violent demonstrations don't require as much scrutiny. That pretty much means that the court has a very large margin of appreciation for nations which argue that an aggressive act has been actioned through a demonstration, meaning it's not that hard to limit a demonstration if it is aggressive. Pretty much there is no issue. Peaceful ones can be limited in anticipation of issues arising. However, this is not an absolute right. There have been cases, as I will get to below, in the case of Ashman and others v. Russia, where the Russian state decided to use their positive obligations to protect areas which they found could be too provocative for the demonstrators, or rather for the demonstrators or the people who do not agree with their opinions, meaning Russia pretty much said, we're going to move this group from a very open and very consequential area, let's say in an urban area, to somewhere where it's more calm, where there's less likely to have interactions, and most importantly then, there's no chance of escalation. However, the court did not find this as proportional, and it wasn't necessary either, because, moving the demonstration can have an effect on the right of giving out demonstrations which actually are consequential. It's not just someone's right to demonstrate, but it's also their right to demonstrate in a way that it has consequences, which actually spreads the ideas which want to be spread. Limiting that right purely based on the fact that you're scared of people outside of that group of demonstrators is a margin of appreciation which can be limited if not properly assessed through proportionality and necessity. And then we have CGAS versus Switzerland, COVID ban on demonstrations, which could lead to imprisonment punishments. I think it was about 3 months. It was not legislative in the light of necessity and proportionality in any matter or form, thereby not okay, meaning they did not do any assessment. They pretty much used their executive powers during a quarantine period to apply laws which limited on rights, which took the right of association and demonstration and made it into something punishable by imprisonment. The implications of doing these things without actually taking the time as a parliament or as a governing organ, meaning you don't have to do the parliament. That would be like I don't know how to call it in Sweden. But what in Sweden or is in English, I know that it's called in Sweden, and it's an institution which decides things rather than, or they control things. Sorry. Anyways, for anyone who's a student in Swedish, bra att tänka på. Det här är ett perfekt exempel på hur RF 1114 skulle kunna se ut i Sverige. Det är bara ett riktigt stort sammanträffande. Hade någon i Sverige, eller hade riksdagen, eller vi ser kanske regeringen via deras rätt, gör en lag som inte alls har gått igenom dessa grejer, som de tekniskt sett kan göra lagligt, då det finns ingen begränsning i regeringsformen för oss att kunna att lägga upp en lag utan att fråga för utskottsbetänkningar eller från lagrådet. Vi kan göra dessa grejer utan att fråga dessa grupper. Vi kan göra en lag utav det. RF 1114 säkerställer att det här inte kan hända. Därmed, det här fallet är ett perfekt exempel av konceptet till att kunna ha en lag som har hög kvalitet. Till er som är lite förvirrade om hur RF 1114 faktiskt funkar, det här är ett jättebra exempel att kolla på. Anyways, sorry to you guys who had to listen to the Swedish part. I hope you skipped through or just waited through patiently without any need to feel annoyed. Anyways, no person can be imprisoned solely based on the fact that they peacefully protested. Now you know. v Turkey and UCP v Turkey are two different cases, which also the reason that both cases are from Turkey is because they have a tendency to limit the rights of Article 11 pretty easily. They do that pretty lightly. Anyways, in one case, the group which was banned on getting to exist, just getting to exist as an organization, was banned, which had implications of wanting to apply Sharia laws into the constitution of Turkey, which was not allowed, meaning it was okay for the courts of Turkey to ban this. And this is because it is banned in the convention to have a constitution or a state based on religious beliefs. That is not allowed. And Sharia is a religiously based state regime, or an option of having a state regime based on religious laws. And then you have UCP, which was, I don't know what exactly UCP stands for, but I know that C stands for communist. They were pretty much communists. In the application, they didn't say per se that just because you could technically have a communist party, that it wouldn't be able to infringe on rights, or be able to be infringed on as a right. Meaning, in the court case, you would be able to see the court of the convention actually checking in to see that the Communist Party hasn't, in substance, actually made anything which could limit upon the state's safety. Meaning, yes, in this case, it was not okay to ban the Communist Party from existing. However, the case did not explicitly say just because a Communist Party could rule a regime, unlike Sharia, it doesn't mean that the group in itself can't cease to exist legally. That all depends on what actual type of effect the group has as demonstrations, as associations, and so on. Meaning, what I mean to say is associations can cease to exist depending on the circumstances. Moving on, negative right not to join. This pretty much comes into, for instance, going into contracts where you might be implied into an association. That's why it's a freedom and a right to associate as well as demonstrate. However, there are some cases where people cannot just say that they don't want to be part of an association due to their right of not having to be part of things. This is specifically for groups which are more state-aligned, police groups, judicial groups, and so on. You also have, I'm going to show, moving on in Article 2 or Protocol 1, it's a common thing where usually these rights are differently looked at depending on what type of necessity, but also what type of literal function and positioning these things have in their context. Now, in this situation, the thing is an association and the context is Article 11. And with this thing, within this context, it happens to be so that because it is state-driven, people within these groups don't have as many rights. And the convention has pretty much gone into this throughout their whole constitution, or quasi-constitution, I think you could call it, by saying that some things in society needs to happen due to the obligation of that role. Meaning, for instance, a dentist cannot appeal to, I think it was the article about the right to not being a slave, because they were forced to work when they didn't want to by law, which the convention found not to be valid, because just because you don't want to work doesn't mean that you as a dentist didn't apply to this job and become educated and specialized in it without being aware of these things. This is called an objective obligation in Swedish, objektiv skyldighet, which I don't know if this is a term which is used broadly within Europe, but it pretty much means that some things are so obvious that the law doesn't even have to explicitly explain it to you. They can say that you should have known. A great example in Sweden is if you don't have a receipt and you buy something online and later on it's found out that this thing was stolen, you could still be punished, because anyone who buys anything should always ask for a receipt or be able to receive one. If not, they should be able to understand through their objective obligations that this is not something that you can proceed with because it's not legally aligned with what should be proven before a purchase.